the contextual issues that actually affect us. So let's look at the load shedding issue. Before I come back to issues around the role of the state in the economy and the role of the private sector and various other factors that should be and will be influencing the debate on the question of what is the future of state-owned entities. So Eskom was created somewhere in the 1920s. It was created at a time when various state institutions were being established, and there's a famous guy called Van der Peil, who was responsible for the creation of Eskom, and I believe subsequently what was called ISCO and many other institutions as well. These institutions were created to serve a minority in South Africa. These institutions, nonetheless, were created to ensure that the industrialization phase emerging in South Africa would have available to it the kind of electricity that it actually required. Even post 1994, Eskom was regarded as one of the best utilities in the world, not just in South Africa. And I think many of you know that. But in about 1998, we had a new policy paper on energy, which was adopted by the Democratic government then, which mapped out many things that we are beginning to do now, many, many years later. It mapped out the kind of shape of the electricity industry that South Africa should have, the kind of role Eskom should actually play within that electricity industry or sector, the way in which Eskom should be reshaped, which I'll come back to in a moment, which is being undertaken at the moment as well, and the role both of the state and the private sector in that context. However, many of those policy propositions were not implemented. And one of the most challenging decisions made at the time, in the early 2000s, was that there's no need for Eskom to build any more power stations, that the private sector would come in and build power stations. I think it took a few more years after that, in the early 2000s, to realize the private sector wouldn't come in. The tariffs were not of the order at the time in order for them to make a profit out of building power stations and supplying electricity. And so the state at the last minute had to say to Eskom, build power stations. But by then, the skills for designing, planning, and executing projects of the kind of order that we are talking about in Medupi and Kusile didn't exist in Eskom. It had all left. More people of that kind of caliber and skill had left subsequently, particularly during the state capture period. And many of our most experienced engineers are now sitting in Philippines, in the Middle East, in Australia, in Canada, and elsewhere in the world. And it's time to call them back and say, come back to Eskom and help us to get what is a very old set of power stations back in order. So in the 2000s, that decision is taken. And what amongst those decisions was to build Medupi as we know it today, Kusile as we know it today, the Ngula pump station, which is, let's call it a dam, where water is pumped up when electricity is available. And when electricity is needed, that water is released. And as it is released, it turns turbines and it supplies megawatts into the electricity system itself. But during this last 10 years or so, or slightly less, what we also had was the focus moving to making sure that contracts at Medupi and Kusile were overpriced. It took too long to actually implement these projects. And where the expectation was that 7,200 megawatts would be supplied by these two power stations with 6 units each, actually didn't turn out to be the case. It didn't turn out to be the case because, for example, each of these units have what they call boilers. The boilers were poorly designed. And as we said today, where each boiler should be giving us about 720 megawatts or 900 megawatts, I beg your pardon, much less is actually produced. In the case of Kusile, there's still 2 more units to construct and complete, and those would only be available in 2023 and 2024 because of all the delays that we've actually had. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as a consequence of that construction process being delayed, we have very old power stations. Over 50% of our power stations are over 40 years old. And they require a huge amount of care and maintenance on a regular basis and on a proper basis in order to ensure that their performance continues at the right level. And for the major part of the 2010s, that was not the case. Proper maintenance did not take place. In some cases, what they call reliability maintenance takes 6 months at a time. So you've got to remove a unit, which could be anything between 300 megawatts and 600 to 700 megawatts, out of action for 6 months, while you give it the attention it requires, and then bring it back into service. And that wasn't done. Instead, what was done was each of these units were driven hard in order to keep the lights on. And sometimes that worked fairly well. And at other times, it actually had a fairly damaging effect on the functionality of those units. In addition to that, there are a number of problems that are being experienced over the last few years. The first is the quality of coal. Each power station has its own unique character, just like each human being has. And if the wrong quality of coal or the wrong mix of coal gets into a power station, it can cause huge damage. Last night, I had a meeting with the coal mining community in order to get a discussion going about how will they ensure that the right quality of coal reaches the right power station. But the coal supply chain has been corrupted. So what we have in many instances, is coal mixed with rubble, coal mixed with rock, coal even having steel particles in them, in truckloads. In one case that I was informed about, a pick was part of what was delivered and put into a power station. And that then causes huge amount of damage and breakdowns to the system itself. The second issue is corruption that still takes place in relation to the supply of fuel oil, the supply of parts, the contracting for maintenance, the overpricing that actually takes place, and there's lots of evidence now around each of these issues as well. And each of them means more money is being spent than should be spent, or sometimes a truck arrives with full of fuel oil, somebody in Eskom signs off for it, the fuel oil is never delivered, the truck turns around and disappears. The next area is maintenance itself. And either the poor quality or the damage caused by coal or the lack of skills within Eskom. Now, each of these areas has been clearly identified. Each of these areas is receiving attention, and you'll hear, and the public will hear a lot more about it in the next while or so, as some of the solutions which will be accelerated are in fact arrived at. So where do we stand today? We don't have enough experienced people within Eskom, so some of the old timers are being rallied so that they can mentor some of the new managers and operatives that we actually have. And in terms of the more recent issues over the last 10 days or so, there's no doubt that the wage dispute became a huge problem in relation to availability of staff, damage to plant, sabotage, intimidation of staff, and people who were key to the operations of power stations as well. So the board, the management, and government as a whole across all of our departments is looking at all of these issues very intensely for some time now. And as I said, solutions are being formulated to ensure that there's more megawatts available within our system, that we eventually get rid of load shedding completely, that for a while we might have load shedding at a lower level, as Eskom itself has actually announced. But there's more clarity now, I think, about how we will actually find the solutions to some of the problems that we actually have. So that's Eskom and his story. So if we look at SOEs more generally now, and this Eskom itself, where board governance has been distorted completely, and I think it's now legend as to the kind of people that were on the boards, the kind of decisions they made, the kind of favors they did for the Guptas, amongst others, in relation to Optimum Mine, for example, and many other beneficiaries of state capture and corruption in this particular process. So where do we go from here? The first is to clarify the question of the role of the state. And the approach that we are taking is one which says, let us take a pragmatic approach, one which creatively combines the resources of the public sector and the private sector. So neither one of them has all the answers, nor is it the case that we're going to stick to all policies for their own sake. So Eskom is undergoing a transformation where on the generation side of our electricity system, we're going to have, and already have, a mixture of publicly owned assets that are generating megawatts, plus a larger and larger investment in renewables and other technology from the private sector. And there's billions of rands that are available for investment in that sector to get either battery storage or gas or solar or wind technology into our system, some of which is already there, some of which is going to be built in the next 2 to 4 years as well. So it is that level of pragmatism that we're going to see on the generation side. We already have, as a result of 2 years of work, the separation of the transmission grid. So this is some 30,000 odd kilometers of wires that we have across the country. And that's what takes electricity largely produced in the Mpumalanga area and transfers it to all parts of the country, particularly the east, the south, and parts of the west. But we also have the best sun shine and solar power available in the Northern Cape, but in the Northern Cape, there's no transmission wires. And so something like 100 to 150 billion rand will have to be spent over the next 10 years in order to ensure that we now have a national grid and we are able to use the kind of resources, natural resources that South Africa has in abundance. The second point is that the government position has always been one of a mixed economy, an economy where both the public sector and the private sector, but importantly, I think even civil society itself, has to play the right kind of role. So Professor Cohen, you referred to the word privatization. That's banned in government language, so to speak. But I think what we are looking at, and again, academia and some of the work that Professor Kobo has done together with his colleagues, with people like Professor Matsukato, is beginning to rethink how state and private sector interact with each other. But it's still at a highly theoretical level. It is still at a level where South African business and private sector hasn't quite developed the intellectual flexibility, but also agility in order to accommodate these new ideas and make them implementable in the South African context. So one of the challenges, I think, apart from the research that we do, is how do you turn that, as the case of an iPhone, which is famous in some of this literature, but more recently, even the vaccines, as far as COVID is concerned, how do you turn that into a reality in South Africa so that we are able to unleash, as I said earlier on, both the resources and powers of the private sector and the public sector, and give rise to more creative innovations that will stand us in good stead in terms of expanding the economy and the economy becoming a lot more inclusive. The second set of factors that we need to look at is some of the international challenges that you actually speak of. But before that, there's still this battle of ideas in South Africa. There's still a dominance of, and Michael Sachs hasn't done enough work in this regard, there's still a dominance of neoliberal ideas in our commentators, amongst the media, and even within university circles as well. And elsewhere in the world, leading intellectuals on the economy and society have clearly come to the view that the days of Reagan and Thatcher are long over, that brand of ideology has in fact given us this extreme inequality that we currently have in our society. And nor does it leave societies with a functional economy that is inclusive, that ensures that all sections of society are in fact beneficiaries of this kind of economy, and that ultimately the well-being of people and all of the citizens in a country are in fact looked after as a consequence of a different kind of approach. So what it means to go beyond that is, I think, one of the challenges that we face in our context. But to do so, there's a whole lot of global trends, some of which Professor Cohen mentioned. One is the kind of unpredictable period that we are living in at the moment. So how do you plan in an unpredictable period where there is one shock or the other? Everybody thought that the Russia-Ukraine problem will be solved in one way or another within a week, and we are months into that problem already. And that has sent secondary shocks into the system, as we now all know. Fuel prices have gone up, food prices are going up. Central banks are going to raise interest rates as a consequence, and that will then dampen growth to some extent on the one hand. And our economists at universities and elsewhere need to help to chart a path through this kind of very complex situation so that we can have inclusive growth moving forward. That's it. This rise in inflation and the consequent rise in prices is also going to have political connotations. It's going to give rise to all kinds of populism, and you can see it in various parts of the world, including South Africa. It's going to give rise to geopolitical rivalry and other forms of culture wars and what people call identity politics as well. And we can see how opportunistic forces within the polity of a country can utilize these sorts of moments for the wrong reasons and create a climate of destabilization which benefits nobody at the end of the day. So in this global context and with some of the South African issues that we actually have, what we are saying is from the government point of view, and that's the work that we've done with the school as well, is that Eskom is but one example of how reforms are taking place within the South African context. And in the process of reform, these questions about the role of the state, the role of the private sector, the role of different ideologies, the role and impact of the phenomena that are unfolding globally, how do we take all of that into account and keeping our orientation as far as the future is concerned on a progressive outcome that is based on social justice values. Now, the mechanical side, if you like, while we take these things into consideration, is the creation of the Presidential State-Owned Enterprises Council by the President. And he articulated both his and government's outlook on this, on the future of the important SOEs fairly clearly on the 10th of February this year, when he said SOEs play a vital role in our economy, from water and roads to energy and ports to defense and aviation. These strategic assets are necessary to keep our country running. It is essential that we reverse their decline and position them to contribute positively. We have therefore embarked on several immediate measures to restore these companies to health at the same time as we undertake far-reaching reforms that will make our SOEs more efficient, competitive, accountable, and sustainable. The council, which I appointed, that is, he appointed in 2020, has recommended that government adopt a centralized shareholder model for its key commercial state-owned companies. And he goes on to say that this model will separate the state's ownership functions from its policy-making and regulatory functions and minimize the scope for political interference. It will also introduce greater professionalism. It will manage state assets in a way that protects shareholder value. And as part of this, preparatory work has begun for the establishment of a state-owned holding company to house strategic SOEs and to exercise coordinated shareholder oversight. To ensure that SOEs are effectively fulfilling their responsibilities, the SOE Council is preparing recommendations on SOEs to be retained, consolidated, or disposed of. So that's the broad direction that we need to go in. But I think we need to be frank with you and say that there are a number of countervailing forces that would say that state-owned enterprises must remain, if you like, in the old form, that they should be open to political management, if you like, but they should also remain in a situation which makes them vulnerable to further forms of extraction and what I referred to earlier on as state capture version 2. So that is the context or contest that is that could be playing out. And again, society, as it did in 2016, 2017, and beyond, when state capture became very evident, when the Gupta leaks took place, which we've got short memories about, and where the conspiracy that was underlying state capture became better known amongst us, some people want to go back there. And what we will have and do have at the moment is all sorts of new narratives being put out, fake news being put out, masking of the true intent taking place in one form or another in order to facilitate state capture version 2. And the important thing, both at a university context, but in terms of public commentary and comments and analysis, is to be able to cut through the superficiality of the narratives on the one hand and get to understand what is the core intent, but also communicate that intent. Because as in 2016 and 17, the last line of defense against state capture is ultimately civil society mobilization. And mobilization of those who have a genuine interest in democracy, those who want to ensure that these resources are utilized for the purposes of benefiting all of the people of South Africa and not just a few, and that these resources are actually utilized in order to bring about change in this country that will ultimately benefit the kind of situation in which the vast majority can say we have housing, we have water, we have electricity, we have a decent life, the youth have a future, there are skills being inculcated, and that all takes us into a different kind of realm from the one that we actually have today. So there are those who, as I said, will put out this kind of narrative. And the challenge for Democrats, for academics, for intellectuals is to demystify some of these phenomena, whether it's the fundamental trends that we've talked about in terms of the role of state, private sector, ideology, etc., or the more immediate issue of laying one's hands on the levers of these institutions, masking the true intent of state capture version 2 in a way in which it will take us another 10 years to figure out that we've lost another 200 billion rands in this process.